Spring 2023 events. Thank you for coming to me. I'm very excited to have with us today Dr. Nukhbah Taj Langah, speaking on digitization, globalization, and Siraiki folk literature. Dr. Nukhbah is an associate professor of English at Crystal College University, and she completed her PhD from the University of Leeds. She is the author of several books, including Poetry as Resistance, Literary and Non-Literary Responses Towards 9/11, and co-edited volume on film, media and representation in post-colonial South Asia. And she also has numerous upcoming books, and all of this is accompanied by her political activism, voicing the rights of the Siraiki community. And we are joined with Dr. Nukhbah, we are joined by Dr. Sara Kazmi from LUMS's Gurbani Center of Languages and Literature. Dr. Sara is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, and she is interested in the literary and cultural production of anti-colonial, Marxist, feminist and left-leaning movements in Punjab, India, Pakistan and the Punjabi diaspora abroad. So without any further ado, thank you. Dr. Nukhbah.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for my elaborate introduction, which maybe I don't deserve, but anyway. I would like to start by engaging with how Dr. Aman invited me, and we talked about what is my research on Siraiki, and he made me think, because my research has expanded from under post-colonial literature, is doing a PhD particularly on Siraiki. I moved towards more complications of post-coloniality, worked on 9/11, worked on partition, post-partition, post-partition ties between India, Pakistan, and that kind of research. But in any case, being a native Siraiki speaker and my passion for and engagement with Siraiki literature and identity is something that I continue to pursue. So I thought I'm going to talk about the offshoots and new focus of my research, and my research interest expanding on Siraiki culture, literature and identity. So this is what I'm going to discuss today. It may not be a linear argument, but it may be pulling important points together in many ways. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about my earlier research explorations, the convoluted context and points of entry in terms of this paper. Secondly, I'm going to talk about challenges of identifying and defining Siraiki folk literature, the nature of Siraiki folk literature and problems of accessibility, approaches towards Siraiki folk literature in this study, and political challenges of accessibility and preservation, and one of the Adebayo and Adema's model of indigenous knowledge, which it is a kind of a recommendation that these kinds of models could be applied to the context such as Siraiki. So here is my initial research. These are the Siraiki poets I worked on. Particularly Aslam Ansari, on the left-hand corner, Safir Lashari, Aslam Javed, Aslam Ansari and Safir Lashari, and then a little bit of translations of Rifat Abbas and Shakir Shujabadi. This was my PhD research, published as a book called Poetry as Resistance, Islam and Ethnicity in Post-Colonial Pakistan. However, I'm not going to talk about this book, but do want to engage in this discussion from the point when I was working on this book. Now, I'm presenting 3 samples of poetry by 3 poets that I worked on. The first one being Safir Lashari. Now, Safir Lashari, if anyone who knows Siraiki or is from the Siraiki context would perhaps know that Safir Lashari was known for writing Siraiki taranas. And these taranas were used as political slogans, and he was also invited to political meetings to recite his taranas. It was kind of a mobilization tactic or resistance literature that he was producing. However, this example, I will show you an example of tarana later on, but this example is from his poem called Siraiki Di Faryad. And I think it really changed the direction of my PhD research and my thought and approach towards Siraiki literature. If you haven't read it and you're engaged in Siraiki literature, please do read it. This is the last band of Siraiki di Faryad, but to give you the context, the poem is about an old woman going to Khaja Farid's shrine and crying constantly. So it's like, I don't remember, but maybe 15-16 band pe mushtamil nazam. So through what happens through the nazam, I'll briefly tell you, but this is the concluding point. So what happens is that she's crying constantly, and one of the caretakers of the shrine observes her, and she's also talking to Khaja Farid. It is a kind of a narrative about her life and the problems of her life. And she talks about, she says things like, of course, the entire nazam is in Siraiki, and she says, मैं बर्बाद थी गई, मैं लुट गई हूँ, मेरे बाला ने मैं कुछ कला छोड़ दिते, मेरी शनाख्त नहीं रही, मैं रुसवा थी गई हूँ, मैं दर बदर ठोकरां खांदी पई. This is the kind of gist she presents. And then this caretaker of Khaja Farid's darbar says that he gets quite emotional, and he says, this is really a sad state. This old woman is constantly crying on the shrine. And in the second last part of the band of the poem, he says that, now can you please tell us what exactly is why are you crying so much, and why are you so depressed and aggrieved, and you think it's important for you to talk to Khaja Farid. So here is the last band where she says, बदबख्त मैं औलाद होंदी गम दी असीरा, घर कहनी मेरा असलू दर दर दी फकीरा, कोई हाल वंडाओ कहनी मेरा सख्त, कोई हाल वंडाओ कहनी मेरा सख्त जहीरा, दर ख्वाजा ते आई आप दी हुण आप सफीरा, तक आईयां मैं ख्वाजा ते सुनाई ते को धाएं, मैं वैली दी मारी हाँ सराइकी मेरा ना है. So the poem concludes on this imaginary or a poetic personification of Siraiki language. This woman is Siraiki language herself, and she says, and she talks about her dilemma, and she says, as a language nobody recognizes me, and when she's saying that I'm talking, my kids have abandoned me. If you read the poem, it mentions like my kids have become judges, they are in important positions, they've become government servants, but I've been abandoned. So I think that was really, really a challenging approach in the poem, and kind of a political resistance coming from a poet who is known for writing Siraiki taranas. So here is one more line from his another tarana, and it's from his book called Asa Khirat Ni Mangde, and it's purely political resistance based book, where he says he's talking about the geography of Siraiki area and the territorial boundaries, and where can you draw a line, and what are the issues of political rights. Here he says Rohit thal daman apne sade hin asa ginsu, asa Lahore Faisalabad ya Gujarat ni mangde. And this poem ends with the lines असां खरात नहीं मंगते, यानी कि असां क्या को अपने राइट्स की भीख नहीं पे मंगते, असां अपने political rights की डिमांड करेंदे पे. So it's surprising that here earlier on he was talking about this woman personified as a Siraiki language, and now he's talking about the rights actually, and his taranas असां खरात नहीं मंगते ते अपने sorry, I'm trying to remember the line. To Sindh Balochistan Divango and Suba Saraikistan Bana, kind of were his political slogans. And the last poet, I really like his work as well. There is a large epic poem, almost 100 paged, I think, slightly over 100, and it is called Sat Sarai. It's a very interesting and must read for anyone who's interested in Siraiki folk literature and political resistance. And his famous lines are "Main tissa meri dharti tissi, मैं तिस्सा मेरी धरती तिस्सी तिस्सी रोही जाई, मैं को आँख ना पंज दरियाई," which means that Panj Dariyai, Punjab, the land of 5 rivers, was created by the colonials, and actually the Siraiki area is an area of 7 rivers, not of 5 rivers. So these were the kind of literary works I was talking about in my PhD thesis. Now, coming from this literary context, and I was talking to Dr. Ghazal as well, that I think thanks to fields like cultural studies and anthropology, that which gave me the chance to come out of the literary context only, and I started looking into things like oral histories, ethnographic research, female perspectives, the bridge between culture and identity, folk and oral tradition, and most importantly, digital and non-digital archives. And I think this is a constructive criticism on Siraiki literary domain or literary circles or critics, that we are so overwhelmed by literature and we are so depressed about our political deprivations that we always keep them, still we keep them separate. We regard literature as a separate domain as compared to the political resistance. However, applying interdisciplinary approach and researches crossing borders between politics, history and literature could help Siraiki researchers develop much more elaborate and critical perspectives. So that is one of the approaches that I am now taking towards Siraiki identity and culture. So my points of entry, which you may also like to regard as research gaps that I find in relation to the research on Siraiki language and literature or culture, is, for example, major focus is on literature, Sufi culture or Sufi poetry, and the influences of Sufi poetry on contemporary poets. Then there is hardly much research done on ethnographic or kind of an archival research or other interdisciplinary approaches. And thirdly, there is really any focus on lack of focus on the endangerment and contemporary literary tradition. And finally, what is folk? Challenges of identifying and defining Siraiki folk literature. So my point of entry and this tentative paper that I'm working on is kind of based on these problems, which I identify as problems because, as I already said, that the poetry and literary culture is so strong that that is fascinating. It's very strong, but the problem I find is that being stuck in that culture, that literary mode of thinking would not resolve the political concerns or identity or cultural concerns that people may have. So similarly, interdisciplinary approaches like ethnographic research, archival research, there is so much to be done. And I don't know if there are any students or researchers on Siraiki here, but I can't emphasize enough that I find, even I did my PhD 14 years ago, and the book that I referred to earlier, but I feel the research on Siraiki is still an empty slate if you come to think of it in a global perspective, because even within Pakistan there is not many good researchers. Secondly, if they are available, they are focused within, they are limited to their own local domain, and their research, there is no one to hear their voice beyond the borders of either Siraiki Waseb or Pakistan. So that's a big problem, and a larger problem is the endangerment of literature. There are no concentrated efforts from the state, from any quarters to save the rich literary heritage that we possess in the form of Siraiki literature or culture. And finally, again, this overwhelming response towards folk without realizing that how folk is still in becoming part of the contemporary literature. So I guess these are the few things that I'm going to talk about next. So we are going to talk a little bit about challenges of identifying and redefining folk literature. And unfortunately, I should be criticizing myself perhaps that I have approached a Western theorist who's talked about what is folk and how they have referred to primitive tribes and subcultures, arts, beliefs and customs, And the crafts like weaving, mode of stacking hay, and language, and they've referred to unwritten literature with beliefs, crafts relegated to broader rubric, traditional folk science or folk poetry, and folk also turning into a product of mass culture. And this is related to the creative ideas of the literature that is being regarded as folk. In dominating culture, folk may have a nostalgic role, while in subculture it may be reflecting a reality. Now, to some extent, this approach is good. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, but here is how Utley has concluded his approach. He says, for my own operation, I will stand by the very simple statement that folk literature is orally transmitted literature whenever found among primitive isolates or civilized marginal cultures, urban or rural societies, dominant or subordinate groups. The heuristic value of orally transmitted, our key phrase, is great. Methodologically, if we are to define a folk category which stands by itself, it has a meaning. We must subject every document to test of authenticity in the matrix of oral process. The definition must be as rigorous as that of the historian, who subjects his charters and annals and memoirs to the most searching textual and contextual criticism. Now, I do find some of the problems in such approaches, because I think that the identification of folk should be more based in the specific context and how that people of that context identify their folk culture or identity. On the other hand, Handu talks about folklore reflected the natural or ordinary discourse in context of India. He critiques how the colonials used anthropological approaches and created the folklorist phenomena, undermining through the ideas such as objectification and Orientalism. Industrial renewal of folklore is also exemplified through Bollywood, ethnic humor, media marketing, and prioritizing metropolis culture over folk culture. Now, I've put the blue and white tile work. It's a picture that we took, my daughter took when we visited Multan. We were purchasing some blue and white tile work for her friend living in defense. And they were constantly communicating on the phone and video calling, and she was going through the shop and showing her. I find that in many ways problematic, because the objectification and exoticization of folk that Handu is talking about in the colonial context is still persisting. For instance, people would know more about Multani pottery or Multani ajrak or Multani handicrafts than about the political concerns or identity issues that people may have. So I think that's problematic, because you can't simply go on like Kashmir. For example, in the case of Kashmir, if people love Kashmiri fabrics, Kashmiri food, but they do not realize the problems related to the political issues of that region, I think then they are purely objectifying that region. So what I'm trying to say really is that there is an example of a Western theorist and a South Asian one, but in both cases there may be incomplete or not really specific context-based understandings of the folk. Now, moving on, now Siraiki folk literature, nature and problems of accessibility is one thing I would like to talk about now. Now, there may be many examples. For people who think that my talk was only going to be about folk literature, I'm sorry to disappoint them, but I'm only going to mention the kind of folk literature that has been produced, but I want to move a little bit beyond that and problematize it further to be able to talk about how this identification of a folk has been transmitted into contemporary literature and contemporary culture. So some examples like Siraiki Akhan, or proverbs as we call it, or poetry related to various cultural practices including weddings, childbirth, lullabies. If you read Sat Sarai, Aslam Javed's poem, you will see many examples of this. Romantic songs, riddles, myths, rituals, folk stories, legends, Sufi poetry, they are kind of examples of folk literature produced in Siraiki. Now, here are some, this is kind of a literature review of some recent research on folk, which was quite locally conducted. I mean, they do talk about a comparison of Siraiki folk literature with American folk tales, or they talk about farmers use folk traditions and transfer them to the younger generation, characterization in Siraiki folk tales, or rarely, sometimes you also find ethnographic study of Siraiki folk tales and male-dominated approach in these folk narratives, marginality of women. So these are the kind of researches I came across these are conducted between 2014 and 19. But I think there may still be gaps because one of the problems is the exclusion of local research. So if they are comparing Siraiki folk literature with American folk tales, so what happens to the local idea of folk symbolism, folk identity, or folkness? Intersectionality between Sufi and folk. Now I find this very problematic, in fact, from the years when I started this PhD research, because I find that in the Western context, Sufism is very romanticized, and there is always this version of liberal Islam associated with Sufism, whereas there is rarely not much discussion about vernacular Sufism. So that's one thing that needs to be explored. That, for example, when I say vernacular Sufism, I talk about Khwaja Ghulam Farid's Siraiki poetry and what is the context of folk, the idea of folk within that context of his Kafi poetry. So in that way, I'm just kind of highlighting gap broadly, but there may be other ways of looking at it as well. And also about uncertainty about the folk traditions. So this whole overwhelming idea about, wow, this is folk, but not understanding the context of how is folk identified and defined within a certain political or cultural context. So next point is approaches towards Siraiki folk literature in this study. So based on Utley and Handu and few other people who've tried to define folk, I'm trying to kind of perhaps redefine it, not entirely relying on how they are going to limit our understanding of folk in a particular context. So I think representing, in the context of Siraiki, folk is representing the diversity of knowledge belonging to a certain community, impacted, and this is very important, impacted by the social, political, historical, and spiritual influences, especially during political crisis, which persists since 1947, I believe. And thirdly, Siraiki folk influences on contemporary poetry. Now this is really important because if we go and dig out what is Siraiki folk literature, we may find rare books, but I think what is more interesting is poets like Ashulal, Rifat Abbas, Aslam Javed, how they are trying to keep this sense of folk alive in their contemporary works. They may be using intertextual references, they may be using authentic folk language or authentic words, for example, in case of Ashulal, or they may be using Khwaja Farid's Kafi writing style, as in case of Rifat Abbas. So in that way, I think the whole idea of folk literature is very, very complicated here in this context. And the most important thing, I think, is as a source of indigenous knowledge and cultural and political reassertion, long-standing traditions from ancestors, and its transfer to other generations in different forms. This is really, really important for me if I want to study folk literature. So traditional local knowledge, and it is this traditional local knowledge, which in this context we are identifying as folk, is the intellectual property of communities and important for the survival of a community's identity, history, and culture. So it is, for example, if you read some of the PhD research, Asan Vaga, or who was supervised by Christopher Shackle, and the thesis is still in SOAS library, he talks about that how the Siraiki literary movement was actually based on the disappointment towards including Siraiki language writers in the anthologies of Punjabi literature. And he's talked elaborately about it. So in that way, I think that in a way, what we are looking at folk right now is our indigenous knowledge, and it is not limited to a particular era, but it is kind of being transferred through generation to generation, also through the influences that these contemporary Siraiki poets kind of want to intentionally reflect in their creative pieces. So next point is political challenges, accessibility and preservation, Siraiki literature. It's really, really important. And as I told you already that, I'm not giving you a linear argument, but pulling threads together, because I think they are all interrelated one way or the other. Now here are some private libraries, and as also referring to my moving towards the digitization and interest in preserving Siraiki literature and archiving it. So the next part is based on this. So here are some libraries which are private libraries and really, really maintained by the families, and they're like personal collections. And on top, most of important for us as Siraikis, I think, is Khwaja Farid Library based in Kot Mittan, and then there is this elaborate Jandir Library in Melsi, Mubarak Urdu Library, Mia Ilahi Baksh Library, Laiya. Sorry, I've mentioned Jandir again. Aslam Rasulpuri. Now these are writers and activists also who are creating their own little libraries within their own personal spaces. Similarly, Zafar Lashari's personal library is created by his son, and Dilshad Kalanchi's library. Now these are all private initiatives, no state support, and no hope for getting funds from anywhere. So throughout it is a struggle that, but I think I should acknowledge and emphasize this effort that people are making, and with this realization, which we never talk about, that what happens to indigenous knowledge if it is not preserved. So if you visit these libraries, I think they are amazing resources, and I don't know how long will they sustain, and where will they get funds to become more established or become more accessible in the global field. But I think they are really, really important resource centers for people working on Siraiki. Now, I had a lot of examples to show you. These are some samples from Khwaja Farid Library we visited in 2017. And you can see that, they have, these are like, some of them are rare pieces of, pieces created by Khwaja Farid or his contemporaries, which are really tattered and dying. And there is really no effort towards preserving it, So I'm not sure how much effort is being made by the library owners, but you can look at the state of the glass, the glass boxes in which they are kept, and this was 2017. And if you visited Kot Mittan, you know how it's an area which experiences extreme hot weather. So there is really no support in kind of preserving these libraries. Now this is Sirai Library, Laiya. It is after Mia Ilahi Baksh. And I think he was I don't remember exactly, but although his son is a government servant, I don't know what exactly Mia Ilahi was doing, I can't recall. But look at the state, they have named it as Sirai Library Laiya, and it is basically a collection of stuff, like papers. We don't even know what kind of stuff, but sometimes we also know because, this image on the right, they have tried to pile up some of the books that Mia Sirai had preserved, but still there is no cataloging and no organization at all. And in a way, there are some ephemeria there as well. Mia Sirai, his son, who's maintaining the library, works in railway services, and he loves collecting stamps. So he has added to the library by compiling stamps. And on the right, you can see the coins that Mia Sirai has been collecting while his visits to Cholistan. And so in many ways, they are very much aware of the importance of this collection, and hence kept it, whether it's in that poor state or semi-organized state, or bags full of old coins, or some tattered albums full of stamps. But I think this is with complete awareness that this is our indigenous knowledge, and this is it represents Siraiki identity and culture. This one, I don't have many pictures. I had a video, but I just couldn't figure out how to show it to you. But Mubarak Urdu Library at Sadkabad is also, it's very organized. It's elaborate, they're cataloging it, but it's still kind of a work in progress. But again, there are huge collections of coins and stamps and all these things there. So, just to wind up, the purpose of referring to these libraries, moving from discussion on folk culture to these libraries, was to indicate that, these rich resource centers that exist within the Siraiki Waseb, and which lack any state support or any support from any quarters, are being preserved by these people. Perhaps they do not articulate it the way we do in Western influenced academia, but they purely do it with the perspective of preserving their identity, folk culture, folk literature, and passing it on to the generations and making it accessible to the upcoming generations and researchers working on Siraiki. So this is, I found this research very interesting. It is an African model where they are suggesting. So I'm kind of ending the whole discussion on the idea that what could be done and what could be the recommendations if this is the scenario in a particular context, i.e. Siraiki context. So for example, use of ICT tools or disseminating the knowledge. Now I think I'm playing some role there, perhaps rightly or wrongly, in terms of disseminating the knowledge, because people don't even know that these places exist. And how many years would it take to use ICT tools to modernize and make these resource centers accessible to be able to preserve indigenous knowledge? That is also a question that I am unable to answer, unfortunately. But again, the participation, there is a lot of acknowledgement by the community, but the community should perhaps support it, these initiatives in some way, with the realization that we are going to use we are going to lose the indigenous knowledge if we don't make these efforts. And next, I think it's also important that, while we are all academics here, and when we are teaching literature, it's really important to highlight the importance of regional literature and indigenous knowledge, folk literature, because I think, even being myself a Western educated academic, I think the Western theory overwhelms us so much that there comes a point where we should realize that it's time for us to theorize now and create theories based on our own regional contexts. And that's not going to happen unless we start having these discussions. So compilation of lists could be one way of doing it, or research on many other languages, which is perhaps the limitation of my discussion today, because I'm purely focused on the Siraiki context. But I do want to acknowledge that there is a lot of scope for many languages to flourish and many resource centers to be preserved. So, sorry I spoke in one go, but thank you so much, and I'll be happy to address the questions.
Thank you so much, Nukhbah. That was a fascinating presentation, and especially for sharing the images and kind of your journeys visiting the different libraries and sort of community resource centers. So thank you also for circulating for me at least a copy of the paper which is in progress. So my comments will incorporate kind of a discussion both of the presentation and of the paper, which Nukhbah shared with me beforehand. And I just wanted to begin with kind of some reflections, and then also along the way maybe raise some questions which you can then respond to. And I'll keep this quite brief because this is quite crowded and I'm sure people want to ask their own questions as well. This paper essentially surveying theoretical approaches to folklore and is at its heart kind of contrasting colonial frameworks with what can be seen as decolonial ones and framing Siraiki folklore as a kind of indigenous knowledge and a body of concepts and interpretations and practices that draw together oral and performative traditions that are stretching the bounds of the post-colonial as a dominant categorization within the field itself. And I think towards the end, the recommendations or the way forward that Nukhbah proposes, and I think that also comes from your background as an activist and as someone who is deeply engaged with sort of actual grassroots and practical solutions, you propose the kind of incorporation of this indigenous knowledge and its preservation through institutional sites such as community archives that will focus on digitization and on pedagogical approaches or pedagogical sort of incorporation into the curriculum that as teachers and researchers for us to incorporate into the classroom. So the presentation and the paper generally details Siraiki efforts, sort of local grounded efforts at preservation of endangered archives in the form of private and primarily activist-run libraries that house not only textual but also visual and material resources such as coins and photographs, I believe, which are gathered from the Siraiki Wasaid and also raises important questions, as we saw towards the end of the presentation, around necessary steps forward through what she refers to also as the proposed globalization of Siraiki folklore. A project and an orientation that will come about through increased translation and digitization that has to some extent be led by these kinds of big, maybe state-funded or externally funded initiatives. So the few reflections I had and the key questions that the research raises for me I would group around 2 or 3 rubrics or themes. And the first of these, I think the most striking for me was how I think your research is contributing to the work of decolonizing. And decolonization in terms of theory, in terms of methodology within the humanities, within the social sciences. And this is, as most of us here would be familiar, a pressing concern that is animating scholarship on the Global South, particularly scholarship on non-English and non-canonical forms of literary and cultural production. So the problem often is with disciplinary boundaries between the fields of South Asian studies and history and post-colonial literatures, which continue to emphasize the dominant forms of the Anglophone novel or the official and the colonial archive. And developing and articulating Siraiki folklore, which is popular cultural production emanating from a marginalized linguistic formation of the region, can really serve then, I think, as a productive site and an institutional shift towards decolonizing the study of regional cultures and also decolonizing even political and cultural theorizations in our parts. That being said, the imperative to decolonize also raises questions regarding the processes and the conceptual categorization and methodology that is to be deployed. So one of the problems that arises, as you yourself point to, is in the term folklore itself, which has a colonial lineage, and it imposes through that lineage and through its dominant deployment a divide between text and orality, between tradition and modernity. And that is a kind of divide and a binary that does not exist in formations such as the Siraiki literary formation itself, where, as you yourself told, also shared with us, contemporary poets are, like Rifat Abbas, are actually deploying and actively engaging so-called pre-colonial or folk genres like the Kafi. So the separation of literature and politics and of folk and print, which you would know very well from the problems of our field, which is English, also kind of are a larger function of the divides of world literature or comparative literature and how these disciplines are conceptualized. And I wonder in that context, if you could comment on what is the Siraiki word or words or concepts for folklore, and how we could operationalize them and use them as theoretical or conceptual categories that can help us work around the limitations and the problems that you identify with the term and dominant kind of perspectives, academic research on folklore, as it were. The second very striking and interesting thing for me in this paper and presentation was the detailing on alternative and in some cases radical practices of archiving that are being carried out at the community and political organizational level. The independent private libraries and activist-run resource centers that were described by Nukhbah in her presentation were, for me at least, completely fascinating to hear about, because it reveals to us what I see as almost an entire counter infrastructure of archiving and museumizing that exists outside the purview of the state, right? And these libraries, in a sense, are functioning as these counter institutions that are documenting and archiving, memorializing, and also disseminating Siraiki literary and cultural texts. And these are sustained through political networks of Siraiki activism and cultural and literary circles that are bringing together organizers, intellectuals, students, and also just members of Siraiki civil society. And I think it's remarkable how these institutions are also serving as sites of resistance in and of themselves. So it's not just that they are libraries that house and preserve Siraiki resistance literature. I think they embody that resistance through their very kind of institutional existence. So in that regard, I think one of the questions that I had was that both the paper and the presentation also suggested a move towards a greater need to incorporate and have kind of funding that is, that will obviously make these projects sustainable, and that would have a kind of possibly a state or an international or an external kind of backing. That what are the possible complications or problematics that can arise from that? So, of course, these archives are right now curating a Siraiki identity and a history of Siraiki political resistance, which will challenge and does challenge dominant Punjabi narratives and dominant Pakistani identity. So what are the risks or what can be lost in the process of bringing in that kind of state intervention? And how will that impact the curatorial intention of these archives? Will there be a kind of, is there a risk of integrating Siraiki culture into Pakistani national culture in a way that will undercut its very regional and its politically resistant edge? So that is kind of one question I had in mind in terms of the propositions for digitization and moving forward. And also just I think in a kind of related but slightly different vein, I was interested to hear more about the charged political context that you refer to in your paper, and I think is hinted at in the presentation as well. And I think what I mean to say is that I think it would be good for us to hear more about the internal and external exclusions and kind of inequalities within Siraiki literary and political circles. I know that the beginning of the presentation there was that beautiful poem which takes us through Siraiki's gendered personification, and also then the kind of question of female voices. I think you said you've been working on that. But how do those inequalities play out? What are the different kinds of stakeholders within movements for Siraiki assertion and identity? And how does that interact with this kind of this kind of what we're calling Siraiki folklore, and what are the internal tensions that surround that archive, as it were. The last question, and then I'll just end, was about the term globalization and the kind of emphasis on translation as an important and necessary step towards preservation and longevity in terms of these archives. So you referenced Christopher Shackle's work, which is extremely kind of important and groundbreaking, and I know that also very, very important within Siraiki circles, right? So in comparison, I mean, he's one of the few non-Siraiki intellectuals who's not Siraiki himself, who has really contributed through his work to that sort of formation and to the language of cultural politics and cultural identity. But that being said, are there issues with pushing for that kind of globalization of Siraiki literature? Is there, a risk of decontextualizing it and lifting it out of the local communities and activist circles that it is embedded in? Because the other side of Christopher Shackle's engagement is that it is also a repetition in a certain sense of the same colonialist logic also of the trope of the white man coming to research, South Asian languages and then translating out of the Siraiki language rather than translating into it to enrich it. So I think that tension between globalization and regional roots, I think also something that struck me, and I think I'll stop there, and I want to just thank you once again for a very rich presentation and paper.
Thank you, Sarah. You've asked me very complicated questions, but I think they're really good because, I can answer them all, but the first one about folk, I do agree that, the idea of folk literature may be rooted in colonial research as well, because, and also perhaps my knowledge of Siraiki language hasn't matured enough to be able to give you a definition of what is folk in Siraiki, because for us, Khwaja Farid's kafis could be folk, or certain kind of poetry could be folk, even in the contemporary context, Shakir Shujawadi could be folk, or Farid's kafi influencing Rifat Abbas may be folk, right? So I think I would really like to look into it, that what kind of word parallels the idea of folk at a local level, right? So I really can't answer that question. I'm sorry, I have my limitations, but I think one of the limitations is that I need a broader reading on, how folk has been termed and defined as. So as soon as I find it, I'll let you know. But I do like to incorporate your concern in my argument. I couldn't take a note, but I think the second question was about how do these resource centers turn into challenging or strengthening the political resistance as opposed to other identities in Pakistan, right? That's the kind of question you asked.
I think if you want me to just repeat, it was about also about just the internal divisions within that activism, and also how do you think that the dominant narrative of the Pakistani state could impact that, given that
I think the idea of alternative narratives is very problematic. I mean, if somebody is doing research on a certain specific context or culture or identity, it is not always about challenging other voices, right? It is because they are concerned that we may lose identity or the richness of resources and literary and cultural resources that once belonged to that particular region, right? So I think this is a limited view that every time these kinds of efforts are made, the question that is always asked, like at least I'm witnessing this question for the past 20 years, that okay, so what happens that they dominate the other identities in Pakistan? Whereas I look at it differently. But perhaps as an activist, I should look at it as a way of only challenging the other identities in Pakistan. But I think being an academic neutralizes my role, and I am thinking out of the box and thinking this cannot be defined only as challenging other identities and narratives in Pakistan, but highlighting the diversity, cultural diversity and the diversity of identities in Pakistan. Okay, so it is a matter of perspective, and I strongly want to discourage this perspective that every time there is research on a particular language or identity, people think, oh, look now Saraikis are going to talk about their political rights, right? So whether you look at it from this perspective or not, people are still conscious of their political rights, right? And they're not taking all these conscious steps only to highlight their political rights, but they're also taking these steps to be able to present a stronger case, or if you like, making a conscious effort towards preserving their identity, because they fear that 50 years later nobody would know Saraiki even exists as a language or a culture, right? So I think that negative approach limits the interaction between academics and kind of creates a hierarchy in academia as well, because you cannot simply be fearing that, if somebody is academically engaging in a certain dialogue, it is purely because it's a political agenda, because whether you regard it political agenda or not, people are conscious about their political identities, right? So I think what I'm trying to say is that this should not be the only approach, because obviously I think as existing in a so-called democracy, it's the right of every culture and people belonging to every region to kind of hold on to their cultural roots or legacies or whatever you like to regard it. The second point in the same question about what efforts are being made, there are no efforts being made. For instance, there could be HEC grants for preserving the local cultures. HEC is in shambles, so we don't know if that is going to be possible. But I think we have to think of the possibilities, and people who are interested in such research, apart from even Saraiki, they need to think about, because globally there are so many research possibilities and fundings and so many, there is a huge, there is no limitation to what we can explore. So I think in that perspective, I think relying on a state which itself is kind of facing a lot of academic issues, or HEC for all that matters, it's not enough. It's a weak argument, and I think researchers need to look for global forums and other means, other research projects or possibilities through which they could establish such researches. I forgot the third.
It was kind of linked to this. It was about the tension between globalization and the regional.
If you want to see the inner perspective, I think there are so many problems, in terms of economy, politics, resources, that it is really difficult to think of the global perspective at this stage, at least for people who are only limited to that global scale of resistance, if you like. For example, if you look at these centers as resource centers, strengthening the political resistance, then I really doubt if they are really thinking about what are the possibilities of globalizing these centers, because they are not even established within their own specific limited regions as well. So after Shackle, as you said, there is not much research, but I would like to add that I should have mentioned it here. Elena Bashir has recently published something on Saraiki. But I do think that globally there is hardly any work being done. I mean, off and on I do get emails from a student at GC or somewhere, I'm doing research on Saraiki, I would like to discuss it and this, that. But I think in that way, no matter how critical we are of Shackle, but I think its contribution is large because it is still alive, it's still being read as an authentic research on Siraiki, and after Shackle, internationally, I rarely see there is any much work done on Siraiki. So it's a big drawback for us. The last point, the situation of resistance. Okay, so the resistance, as you know, is also in a way limited to that particular region. And one example I'll give you is that if we conducted a rally at Multan city center and we are saying we have a problem with the census and here are our problems, we cannot send a press release to Lahori newspapers because it's never going to be published. So how do we get out of that local domain? Because until or unless we have a friend in an English paper who's going to be pro-Siraiki and publish something about Siraiki resistance, we cannot, हम लोग कुएं की बैठक बना के रख दिया गया. Whether it is about resource centers, whether it is about academic research, whether it is about political resistance. So if it is happening there, we are kind of tucked into the background and said, अच्छा चलो वो तो करते ही रहते हैं तो करने दो उनको जो करना है. Whereas that doesn't mean that there is no resistance.
I love the discussion. I'm not Siraiki, I think, but I'm not Siraiki. I'm from the north, as you mentioned. I'm from Ahmedabad. I have about 3 questions. One, do you think in a country like Pakistan, where one, is Siraiki an ethnic or linguist identity? 2, if it is either or both, then how does it fit into a country like Pakistan where such identities are so fluid? I'm a native Hindu speaker. A lot of the words that I see in Siraiki are quite, I can understand them. I speak the way you and us have spoken is quite similar. So how do you define these separate identities when they're so interconnected, even with Punjabi, even with Sindhi? We can understand each other. And thirdly, the concept of the way you mentioned just right now, like in Lahore, there's no worries about identity or separate provinces or the rights of the people. But in the north, it is something that our community, even at LUMS, discusses quite often, that if we don't fit into a paradigm of this modern Punjab-centric view of the Pakistani, we're not well accepted. Our cultures are, they're sidelined. So how does that translate to Siraiki culture, and how does that community that resides outside of the Siraiki region in Punjab kind of cope with that?
Well, I think your first point, in my book and my doctoral research, I referred to Siraiki as ethno-linguistic identity. Okay, so it is both ethnic and linguistic. And I precisely want to highlight the point that whenever Siraiki activists or movement is criticized, तो उसको लसानी का एक लफ्ज़ दिया जाता है ना. In my view, I've argued this in my book as well, that in my view, you can't separate identity from language. If somebody says I'm a Punjabi, so there is a certain culture you carry with that identity, right? You can't say कि मेरी ज़ुबान पंजाबी है लेकिन मेरा culture पंजाबी नहीं. How can you say that? So it's the same, like if you say you're a Siraiki, you have, despite the fact you may live in the UK, USA or Lahore or anywhere, there are certain aspects of that culture that you will grow up with through your parents or through the folk tradition, oral tradition, whatever you want to call it. So I hope that addresses the first point. The second is that, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I have Hindko friends as well, and the way the people from other regions of Pakistan would respond or be sensitive towards any discussion on Siraiki, people in Lahore would hardly do that, and I think that's a biased perspective in many ways, because it's stigmatized. The discussion about such identities is stigmatized because people fear कि ये एक पेंडोरा बॉक्स है, और अगर ये बात शुरू कर देंगे पॉलिटिक्स की, प्रोविंसेस की, तो अब ये नहीं तो अब हज़ारा प्रोविंस बन जाएगा और फिर ये वाला प्रोविंस उठ जाएगा. So I think that's a very problematic approach, and the only way that could be neutralized is perhaps having more talks like this at LUMS, or like what I think really lacks in Lahore, despite spending so many years in academia here. I feel that we have fascinating students. Like I'm leaving. I've left my job, and I've thought of other perspectives, prospects in my life, but every time that what stops me is my students, and irrespective of whether they are Saraiki, Punjabi, Sindhi, Pakhtun, whoever, right? Because like we see a lot of hope in you, and I think कि मतलब students को इस किस्म के dialogues में identity related issues में को contradictory या stigmatize नहीं बनाना चाहिए, but engage, to detach yourself from your roots. I think you have everything in the world to lose, and if even if you become something in life and don't own your identity, then you are nothing in life.
Can I just add to that? So I think the one operative and important category there is that of class. Because it's not just about identity. Because if there was no, if there, and also gender, by the way. So I can't speak to the experience of Siraiki, but I can speak to Punjabi, which is as a woman who researches Punjabi literature. I've gone to Punjabi conferences where men will speak Punjabi to each other but not to me, because it's considered a rude and vulgar language, not appropriate for speaking to a woman, right? So the other, outside of cultural identity, the reason that the Siraikis in urban centers, in locations of wealth and power, where these things are being accumulated, where people are trying to embrace to go from either working class to middle class or from middle to upper class, they are obviously, language is a marker of, in that language, these languages are a marker of being functionally illiterate, or so that transition from, it has gone from Urdu being that language of privilege and the language that would get you jobs at once upon a time, to now English being that language. So now you even see the Urdu speaking families moving away. So whereas in the Punjabi and Saraiki families are trying to speak Urdu, speakers are trying to, so because that's the language of basically the economy, and so class is a really important category that it would explain a lot of those behaviors.